Hey, welcome everybody. So today we're talking about vocal ranges. It's a great place to start if you're new to all of this. Um, but also it's something that can get very specific as you get to understand your voice a little bit more. So we'll go through some different sort of systems and ways that you can find your range and just talk about the variables. As always, it's a couple variables that actually helps us really define our range rather than just one sort of simple answer. So that's why this gets kind of confusing. Um, and we'll talk about sort of like a really simple way that you can get a sense of your range versus slightly more complicated ways that you can start to understand your voice and where it fits in the whole scheme of voices. So please ask questions, as this is a really good place to start. And I know a lot of people fundamentally have issues because they don't quite understand where their range fits in. And if you don't really know where your range is, it can be really hard with pitch matching, with finding good repertoire, things like that. So yeah, that's going to be the main process here. And we'll talk about the like basic formula and the themes and titles for each type of range. As sometimes I get people who are new to all of this, and then they sort of tell me that they think they're a certain range, and it's drastically different from what I actually hear. Let's talk about it. In the simplest sense, we have these four kind of main titles that give us our lowest singers all the way to our highest singers. And so first, I'm just going to talk about sort of the framework, and then we'll talk about how you can figure out how you fit into it. So we have bass, and bass is the lowest side. And you'll see in other musical, with other musical terms like the bass clef, right? When you're talking about sheet music, that's the lowest clef, right? Versus like the treble clef being for our higher vocalists. So we'll talk about that. Also, like if you think of like a stand-up bass or like a bass line on a guitar is going to be the lower notes. So that's our lowest side. So we have bass, which typically is going to be our male vocalists, although we'll talk about how there can be some ambiguity in the middle for sure. But when we look at like the general scope of people out there, basses are almost always our lowest male vocalists. And then we have baritone, which is in between tenor. So bass is our lowest, baritone is our next lowest, tenor is a high male vocalist, which stretches into even kind of like alto realm, although we just generally call it tenor. And then we have alto, which tends to be one of our lower female vocalists. Again, there's ambiguity there in the middle, mezzo soprano in the middle, and then soprano on the very, very top. So you can think about, in the simplest sense, our vocal ranges with our pitch range in general. And I'll talk about like the specific sort of zones where that is in a second. But that's sort of like the first framework, is just thinking about our overall pitch range. This is going to be like the middle of the piano if you're thinking about all of the notes. The farthest side of the piano on the left are beyond what we can sing, and the farthest side on the right are also beyond what we can actually sing. So if you're looking at a piano, your bass vocalists are going to be more towards the left, and your tenor and altos are going to be kind of in the middle, and your sopranos are going to be off to the right. And we'll go into some specifics here. So usually bass vocalists will have a range, and I can't demonstrate this because I'm a tenor, but they'll be down kind of around here is where the lowest notes are, and they sometimes extend even lower, but around here. And so we'll just talk about the lowest notes of each range for a second first. Our baritones are going to typically be around here or lower, around here to here for our lowest notes. Tenors are going to be around here, sometimes a little bit lower, but to here is a pretty common spot. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I cleaned myself up with my haircut. So yeah, this is a really, really great way to just start to get a framework of your voice. So again, low basses, are going to be often around this low E here, sometimes around C. Baritones are going to be around this range. Tenors start around here, and sometimes a little lower, and sometimes a little bit higher. We'll talk about how this is all kind of just like a spectrum, so you don't want to put yourself too much in a box, but this is the first sort of simple framework. Then we start to get to altos, and our lowest altos kind of are around where tenors are. So maybe around here, and sometimes a little bit lower. But that tends to be a zone for the bottom part of an alto range. And then as we go up, we've got sort of our mezzos, which kind of will be in a similar area, but sometimes up a little higher like there. And then as we get to sopranos, they start up maybe around here and sometimes a little bit lower. So you can see it's just sort of like this overlap, right? At that point, once we've gone all the way from a typical bass range, this area, all the way up to soprano, it covers about 2 octaves, and that's our typical starting point for each of the ranges. So you might be like, okay, how do I fit into all of this? We'll talk about the higher side in a second, but the first place you're going to want to start is where is the bottom of your range. So I talk about this concept of like the 3 register test. This is something you'll see online as well, but it's a really nice place to start. A little bit of imitation here. So the lowest part, you're going to want to think of like a couple different concepts. One of them is like you're doing a hum, but you're kind of doing this sort of like thinking voice where you go like, right? And you see, okay, right? My voice tends to sit around there. And if I find that and I trace on a keyboard, or you can use like an online pitch monitor and actually see where your voice is sitting, that's going to be your low end of your chest voice. So if you're like, right, you can actually hear it's somewhere for me in that tenory range, maybe a little tenor baritone. As you learn to do range extension, it can get a little more confusing. Again, don't put yourself in a box, but it's a good place to know where your starting zone is. So if you're a bass or a baritone, you might find that thinking voice actually is a lot lower. The other one that's kind of silly, and this might be not as helpful, but it's funny, is to think of your sort of like deep belly laugh, almost like maniacal laugh, right? So if I'm like, ha 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 ha, like that's ha 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 ha. It's like somewhere around that sort of range. But I find that the thinking one is the best because it's a little more relaxed. So you're like, and then that's going to help you find where that bottom side is. So if you're an alto or a soprano, when you do that, it might be like, right? That's more alto-y sort of a range. And if you're a soprano, it might be like, right? It might be up in that sort of spot, actually. Again, there's all sorts of overlap here. So that's the first sort of zone. The next one is sort of where your middle chest voice range is. So for this one, you want to think about like calling out to someone across the room. And so you just go, hey, hey. And you might find that there's sort of a toggle between 2 different zones, right? So with all of these, don't try to just hold a single pitch. Do a little bit of a slide, even with like the kind of does a little bit of a slide, right? And this one is like, hey, hey. So if you see that for my voice, like, hey, hey, right? Hey. It's actually right around like a D or an F above middle C, which is very common for a tenor range. So if you find that that's higher than that, you're probably more into alto or soprano. And if it's lower, then you're like, hey, hey, and that's more common to you. You're gonna be more likely baritone or bass. And again, you can use like an online pitch monitor to really see where this is. Now, here's the trick though, and I want you to be careful about this because when I do this with people, sometimes they just imitate my voice, and then you're not really finding this. So the thing that you have to do is try to kind of do this on your own time when you're not influenced by my voice and just see where you naturally land. And you might do it a couple times actually. So like over the course of a couple of days, and you'll see that there's a little bit of flexibility here. That's going to give you a zone of the bottom of your chest voice to the top of your chest voice, going from to hey. So for me, like and then hey. That's going to be that sort of range of chest voice. And then the third sort of step is to do your sort of like woohoo cheer, right? And this is going to be in head voice, and you're going like woo, right? Woohoo! And again, don't try to push too hard. Just find where it kind of naturally sits for you. Um, so I have a pretty high head voice, but woo, that goes all the way up to this F. And you'll find again, like tenors, sort of a weird place. A lot of things in the middle, we can learn over time to stretch our range and expand. Like, I could pull off baritone sometimes if I'm careful not to overly warm up, or if it's early in the morning. If I'm really working on it and I do a lot of head voice stuff, then I can sing more in an alto range. This happens sometimes, like if you're in like men's a cappella group or something and you're singing the very, very top line, it tends to be alto and even more in that sort of like sopranist kind of place, which is like a tenor imitating soprano. So sometimes, like I'll do that. And you'll find, even like baritones can learn to sing very high up into their head voice. So again, don't make this a limiting factor. It's just feeling sort of where your voice gravitates. So what we'll find if we're talking about the top side of chest voice for every range, so right, that's that like hey concept. For our basses, it's probably going to be around here, like hey, hey, right? Again, it can vary. You might be like, hey, mine's much lower than that. That's that's totally fine. This is just an average, right? For our baritones, like hey, hey, right? Gonna be maybe in that sort of range. And for our tenors, hey, hey, it's gonna be all the way up there, and you'll hear it's kind of a much brighter sort of sound. And maybe even a little bit higher. Then we get to what's interesting, which is for our altos, it tends to be kind of in a similar area as the tenors for the top of the chest voice, and maybe a little bit higher, right? So like, hey, 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 and it might be up in that sort of range where you're still actually in your chest voice. And this is up to like a B flat. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there you go. So like that's a really great example, and we'll talk about there's other things involved too. So I don't want to just put you like right in a box here, but someone's asking like if I've got a range down by this like A2 G2 and up to an F5, right? So like that sounds like a baritone range, right? And you might find that you can extend up into a little bit of tenor and a little bit lower into sort of the lower baritone. But that sounds like a typical kind of a baritone thing, with a little bit of a higher extension right up to that F, if you're doing that without strain. But when you're talking about your highest, are you talking about head voice? That would be my question to you. Like we'll go over this in a second, but we were just doing low chest voice and high chest voice. And then as we go, so if you're talking about head voice, then that is an indication that you're more on the baritone side, not having that high extension. But it also might be something where you're just not used to connecting to your head voice and getting good chord compression. And so something I would want to work on is figuring out if you can extend that head voice a little higher, because sort of based on the general idea of ranges, my inclination is that you would have that a little bit of that extension. So then I guess my question to you, Supermax, would be where is that hey sort of sit, right? Where is the middle spot? So we want those three different zones, and that really helps us get a sense of it. But I would still probably put you in the baritone range, right? So not super low, not super high. And that would be a great sort of rough estimate. So that's just one aspect of all of this. Again, the simple concept is hey, using a hum to a hey to a woohoo. So like and see where that kind of sits, and then hey, hey. And then really when you're doing the hey one, imagine someone's kind of farther away. So you keep it moving a little bit. And so it doesn't get too sort of close. It just helps us sort of intuit this a little bit more and project our voice. And then go to woo, woo. Um, so see, this is so Supermax. This is a good example of like, I think there you probably would have some head voice extension, especially if your hey ends up being in a similar place. That means maybe you just haven't fully unlocked your head voice, but I would still probably put you in like a baritone range. And there's some other reasons why I would say that, and some of it is also about not using maybe your head voice as much and it not being um, as sort of like ultimately, like if we don't use that range, it's not going to be as strong or it's not going to be um, uh, like as developed, right? And it kind of like over time, like the muscles get harder to use. So I would recommend that maybe just exploring some of your head voice range, and then we're kind of talking about range extension. But like theoretically, a baritone will have a little bit of a higher head voice, right? Extending up just a little bit past that, maybe to like woo, woo. Maybe up to even a C would be something that I think would possibly be available. And then tenors are going to be higher. And then for altos, right, just to keep up sort of the trend that we're talking about, your head voice is maybe going to be up towards like woo, up to that sort of high F as well, similar kind of like to a tenor, and it right just depends on the style of singing that the person has. Um, and then sopranos are going to go all the way up even to the C and even a little bit higher. And then we go into sort of like the whistle tony sort of register, which is a whole other kind of extended technique, often available to sopranos and mezzo sopranos. And then I missed the mezzo soprano, but it's essentially just kind of in the middle between the alto and the soprano range. So it's a little murky, right? When we think about pitch range, we can't just use that as the only variable. Um, but that's going to give you a general sense. And you'll actually see that there's like singing apps and things like that, where the algorithm, the AI being the new forces at play, will register kind of where those different parts of your registers are. And then it will give you a spit out like an answer, like you're probably a baritone or you're probably a tenor. It's funny, like you look at some of those and they're sometimes like the ads are, I'm like listening to it, I'm like, that sounds like a tenor. And they just said baritone. And this leads to another thing, which makes it more complicated and a little more subjective. So um, yes, A2 to A5 sounds like you've got like the high baritone tenor range. And again, same thing for SC vocal student. Is A5 your head voice, or is it just the top of the chest voice? So with all of these, you guys are giving me two, and I would recommend to think of it as actually three different spots. And that's going to give you a better sense. It's funny, for a lot of male vocalists, we tend to only think about chest voice, and you'll see this in some of the books. Uh, so when people use that that term, it's usually like a whistle tone kind of a thing, and that probably will be even a little bit higher. But it's the same thing, like a lot of male vocalists, we tend to not work on our head voice as much. So I usually find that it's higher than people would think once we connect to it appropriately. But it depends on the kind of style of singing that you typically do. That gives me also like a sense of probably you're also in a baritone range. So another thing to think about is like the middle ranges tend to be the most common. So when we're talking about types of ranges, not that it's like, oh, I'm so special because I'm an uncommon voice type, but like baritones and mezzo sopranos tend to be kind of like the most common voice types because they're in the middle. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and so sometimes when we think about like strain, that's a sign of like, where the limits of our technique is. And yeah, you want to think of like where you can kind of comfortably do this, but over time it might expand, right? But yeah, for both of you, it sounds like you're in sort of a baritone range when we're thinking about pitch. So that's the first side of it. And you can do that on your own. You can use an algorithm, or you can use like a pitch monitor, and you can get a sense of your range. So that's like the simplest way. It's a good place to start. Um, and again, most people are baritones and mezzo sopranos. Um, so for typically again a male vocalist, baritone, female vocalist, mezzo soprano. There's a lot of overlap in the middle. A contralto can be lower than a tenor vocalist, or can be you could consider like a tenor vocalist sometimes as a contralto, like especially as we go up into these really high kind of belty places. Like a lot of contemporary music for tenors actually kind of exists up in that kind of contralto-y range. Um, and so, you know, use it with a grain of salt. Like the it's started out as a kind of a gendered sort of framework, but the middle is truly a little more ambiguous. And so we'll get to some other concepts here. Um, Timbre being a huge variable. So you have pitch range, and then the other one is going to be your timbre is going to influence or weigh in on this a little bit. Again, I'm going to use some generalizations. And there's all sorts of little subtle variations based on these mixes of pitch range and timbre. So typically, lower basses have this kind of bright, kind of rumbling kind of a sound in the chest. But the overall range as it goes up kind of sounds very uh, dark and kind of heavy. This is where like baritone gets its term, is literally like a heavy tone. And so it sounds like a little more weighted. And that might also have to do with where like tension patterns start to happen and where we start to kind of involve strain and other things. But you'll find like the deepest basses kind of have this. It's funny because it's not just like a dark sound, it's a rounded kind of but also sort of a mix of bright and rounded, and sort of like a rumble in the chest. So like the chest cavity sympathetically tends to vibrate more. And there's going to be um, a different. Oh yeah, we'll get to that in a second. There's going to be like a less head voice typically for a bass singer. They're going to want to exist a little more in their chest voice range. But the timbre is going to be a little darker, is what we tend to say, or warmer. As we go to baritone, somewhere in the middle. And then as we get to tenor, it starts to sound a little lighter and a little brighter, right? So you can think about like my speaking voice inherently has a tenory kind of sound. If I kind of talk like this, I'm imitating a little bit of the baritone thing. It sounds kind of silly, right? It's like a character thing. But if your voice tends to drop down into there, that's more bass baritone. If you tend to live on these higher formants a little bit more, you're more likely in a tenor range. So your speaking range gives you also some indication. It's probably going to be somewhere in the middle between that and hey, right? It's going to sort of fluctuate in that sort of zone between the two. So that's that sort of framework. And another thing you can kind of think about is like the bass, baritone, tenor almost has like an exact parallel to alto, mezzo soprano, and soprano, just in like an octave higher. But it's going to have a similar kind of a thing. Like altos tend to have a reedier or like sort of a darker tone to their voice. Mezzo sopranos kind of have a flippy kind of in between, can kind of go both ways a little bit. And then sopranos tend to have that lighter kind of floatier sound. So when you think about timbre, think of it more like the type of resonance or the tier of resonance that your voice likes to find stability on. So that's where that sensation of like, a bass baritone kind of sounding like it comes from below and up into the mask. Tenors floats in a little bit like that. And you could think the same thing for altos, right? A little bit lower coming up into the mask. And then sopranos, it's going to float in from the top. This is kind of how we think about like mixing and registration and stuff, is sort of like what angle does your voice does the resonance sort of sit. That's how we perceive timbre, right? It's about like what overtones tend to be more emphasized. So that's a huge part of it. Now let's talk about these questions you're asking, Deborah, like difference between range and tessitura. When we're talking about range, we're talking about this is kind of like what SC and Supermax were talking about, like this when we like push and we feel like strain, or it's like a disc, it's like there's discomfort there in certain areas, you can hit it, but it's not a place that you like to comfortably live. That's like a good example of pitch range compared to tessitura. Tessitura is like I tend to sit in a certain place because it's more comfortable in my range. So like tenors, for example, if I had a song that's kind of has the tenor range, but just sits down on the bottom part of my range the whole time, it's going to be a little fatiguing actually on my voice. It's going to feel like I'm kind of pressing, and I'm not going to be able to put as much energy into the sound because the tessitura is too low. It's kind of like the average of the notes tend to sit too low. So like a tenor can hit like a few notes on the bottom, but we want to get up to this middle C area, and that's where our voice truly like opens out and resonates more. Um, so the timbre is a little bit associated with your resonance cavities, but it's also it's really just probably has a lot to do with the size of the vocal folds um, more than anything else, which is going to give you more access to certain spots. But that starts to be a little bit like hypothetical. You know, there's complexity to it. Uh, but yeah, some of it has to do with the anatomy, right? I mean, generally that's going to be part of it. But I don't know if I would necessarily say it's like the size of the cavities themselves. Um, but we do find that um, like we can making the cavities a little bit smaller, we can go towards brighter sounds, and going towards like creating more space. We can get like a darker kind of tone and lower our overtones. So yes, think about like all instruments, right? We have smaller instruments are going to be higher pitched, and bigger instruments are going to be lower pitched. So um, that certainly plays a role in it. But I'm always hesitant to say like that's exactly what's going on because it is complex. Um, yeah. So like so like if I'm like doing the lower bass kind of a sound, like again I'm a tenor, but you might be like no 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 no, right, and you're gonna hear a lot of that kind of buzz for uh, bass baritone. Um, Baritone might be a little bit more in the middle, right? Like oh, oh, and then tenors are going to be like no, no, no. Right, I can kind of sit in that sort of higher place. Um, Altos are going to be probably around no, right in that sort of zone, and then sopranos are going to be all up in this whole area of like right, and even higher than there, right? I can't fully demonstrate that, but uh, that's that's really kind of the concept. So uh, yeah, so this is what we're going to talk about is like you could have an alto range but sound a little more soprano-y, and then this is like just like what you're saying, and so that's where we get these concepts of like fachs, right? Or like there's other terms for this in other languages, but they're like subdivisions where it's like someone with an alto range who sounds a little bit lighter and closer to a soprano, and so people can kind of get more specific like that. So that has to do a little bit with your timbre. The other side of it is also where your break range is, and this starts to get like more complicated. So you can see like pitch range, really simplistic. You can do your hey, woohoo thing, get a sense of your range. Then we start to think about the timbre of our voice. Is it like a darker, heavier tone, or is it lighter and more floaty and bright? Um, and uh, yeah, and then yeah, sometimes you learn by just the nature, like the nature of music that you're singing. We'll get to that. Like singing in a choir gives you a really good sense because you're hearing all the different kinds of voices, and if you're talking about like tessitura, you're singing in a certain tessitura a lot of times because you have other voices that are going to be stacked, and that's going to give you a sense of like, man, when I sing in alto, my voice feels really stuck, right? Probably need to be singing soprano. Or man, when I'm singing soprano, I'm really fatigued and I'm singing too loud, like way louder than the other sopranos. You probably need to go to alto, right? So this is how we can start to kind of think about this is like oftentimes different ranges different voice types are going to be able to sing with more dynamic variability in the like certain high ranges. So like a baritone can sing up to like that F, right? You know, like what we're talking about, the yeah, hey. But it might sound really big and booming. Whereas like for me as a tenor, I could sing it like that. It'd be like na 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 na, and it can just sound very very light. And that's true also for sopranos up in their highest register. They can kind of sit there without it sounding like a lot of energy. So some of it also is that concept of like where does your voice open up and where does it require a lot of energy to maintain like higher chest voice or higher head voice. And of course we can learn to kind of balance this out and confuse people, um, and sing in sort of like a little bit more of a wide range. We think of that as right as like our range extension concepts. This is where it gets kind of confusing. Like a good singer, like for me, like I can kind of stretch down to baritone up to like mezzo soprano-y sometimes, right? Depending on what I'm doing. Sometimes for the demonstrations of like particular singers, I want to sing their songs. So that's when you can really hear like doing that kind of imitation, but I can't really do that on the live streams. So that's for another thing at some point. But that's, you know, like there's all sorts of things out there, people trying to like imitate like a high soprano, but being a tenor or a baritone and still being able to make that sound really like really close to like a female vocalist, and they're adjusting their timbre right to sort of get that sound, and maybe other sort of stylistic things that happen. So so again, pitch range, timbre. Let's talk about break range. So this is kind of a funny one, and you want to be careful here when you're playing around with your break range. Like, don't hurt yourself. Like you don't have to put force into your voice to find your break range. In fact, thinking about like, yeah, you're probably going to find a spot where it builds up too much pressure and it switches, and it's your body kind of does this automatically. If you know how to crack on command, you can start to kind of do this imitation. But it's really just where you transition from chest to head voice. And there's going to be a zone, and it's this. What the hard thing about this concept of break range is, it generally is in a zone, but you can actually like make your voice crack on the very bottom side of that zone or the higher side of that zone. So that can really confuse people, especially because the voice types, if you look at break ranges, they're actually like not that far apart from each other. They're often like 3 or 4 notes different, and just slowly going higher or lower. And I can crack in different spots in my range like throughout once I understand how to do this. So you don't want to think of it just like where your voice cracks or your break range, but you want to think of it as where it starts to transition. So and this is where this part gets a little complicated. So we'll talk about some other sort of concepts here on top of this. But like what I would simply do is like take an ah or an kind of something neutral, and just don't try to put extra volume into your sound. Just go like and like let it do a little weird instability thing. Right? I was like right somewhere around here, right, and that's indicative of a tenor, which is having your break range around F sharp or G sharp above middle C. Um, So what I'll do is you can just kind of slide up. You could also go from A to E if you're uncomfortable with forcing a crack, like, you know, even the concept of forcing it. You're not forcing it. You're just going up until it naturally occurs. Do like A to E and just go like and you can start to hear where that is. Um, Somewhere around in between that range for me. So where that sits also can tell you something about your voice typically, but you can learn to smooth that out over time, which is what's funny, right? I'm like, but I'm still aware of it's in that sort of zone, and understanding where your break range is really helpful for your overall technique, so that you're careful not to do something with the wrong registration and get kind of stuck and stall out and have one of those moments where you're like, and it's really like unstable. That's the other thing, is try imitation. Like you can go like, once you know where it is, you don't have to do that wide scoop. You can kind of like, Right, it's gonna jump to a higher pitch, which is really funny too. So that can kind of be confusing when you're trying to figure it out. Um, Again, do this on your own time. If you try to do it where my voice is and your voice is not that, you might confuse yourself a little bit. So same concept. It is pretty. So yes, I like that you're saying the term like directional. Like I think I'm following you on this. We might be talking about it slightly differently with the representation of these variables, but like the pitch thing is a very obvious continuum from low to high, and the break ranges are pretty similar. Like they're going to go a little bit higher and higher for each voice type, uh, it kind of in the same exact zone. So like your bass baritones, like your break range might be like somewhere around that middle C, D, and E, right? Or maybe a little lower, like A to E, like ah, right? And the tenors are going to be probably be around this sort of like right in that sort of range. Altos are strangely enough kind of in almost the same exact spot, right? So like, you might think of like right, might be where that break range starts to happen. And for sopranos, it's like almost exactly an octave higher than the tenor range. So thinking about like maybe like up here, up all the way there, right? It might be where it starts to switch actually. So um, it really just depends. But that kind of follows the pitch range for the most part, but it gives you a slightly more specific understanding. And then you add that with this variable of like darker, heavier tone compared to being lighter, and it being able to sing higher notes with just more flexibility and a lower volume. That's actually going to be more towards the like soprano or tenor side of things. And you can see there's almost like this exact octave sort of difference between like bass to tenor and alto to a soprano. And then the tenor and alto kind of have a lot of overlap in the middle. Um, so you can start to kind of figure it out from there with those three variables. And then the other one is a little bit of that concept of the tessitura as well, which is like, what register do you prefer to sing in? Are you like more comfortable singing in? So like lower voiced singers going to be more in their chest voice, whereas typically higher voiced singers are going to sit more in their head voice or their mix. And so that's sort of that concept of the tessitura thing as well. So all of those variables play a role in figuring out your voice type. So you can do all of those as kind of like a test. The timbre one is a little bit like a character thing too, right? You have to really listen to your voice and listen to other types of voices. You might look up like, famous baritone singer, famous bass singer, famous soprano singer, and see if your voice sounds kind of similar and what that's like. And that can kind of help guide you as well. And then there's this concept that kind of adds another layer, which is like character type, right? Like, so the thing is when we have these voice types, we start to have like typical kinds of roles that fit things. And then we kind of fall into this sort of archetypal kind of thing, or like whatever our particular contemporary paradigm is. Like a lot of sopranos right now in contemporary music do that kind of like light, ethereal, kind of whispery sound, like whisper pop kind of a thing. And altos tend to do a lot more of that kind of belting thing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that case. It's just a little bit of like an archetype. So you'll find, like if you think of like opera or musical theater, right? Like we have these, again, they're just stereotypes, but like often the evil characters or like certain character, the fatherly figures are going to be more of that like very low baritone bass thing. You get these like wistful kind of romantic roles, can often be tenors, and that younger kind of sounds sometimes. And then it's similar kind of thing happens for altos and sopranos too, right? So like you get like in a lot of musical theater, you can get, or like Disney musical theater, some of the like more evil characters, or like there's various, again, types for this. They're going to be in that like lower alto range, and then the sort of like more youthful, um, sort of like often, again, the romantic roles. It's funny how like sort of stereotyped it can be if you think of it that way. It changes of course over time, but that tends to be more of the soprano-y kind of a thing. And then you start to have like these kinds of like personality choices and things like that that come with those types of singers, and that can kind of play a role. So if you find yourself like gravitating towards certain kinds of songs that you really like, that can also be an indicator. This gets a little more complicated. That's why I'm sort of a little more wishy-washy with it, because that like, like as I get to know a student, I get a sense of like what kinds of characters and styles that they like, and that can also help you understand a little bit about your voice type. Although that's probably the least strong to me compared to pitch range, timbre, and your passaggio or your break range, or where it starts to transition, right? And also your tessitura and concepts of like where your voice tends to sit more often. Um, so like what, for example, one thing that I'll find is sometimes people like a certain kind of sound, but it's not actually, or a certain singer, but it doesn't fit their voice type. So we have to learn to modulate and find sort of that type of voice in a different range. And that's what's so interesting is, so like once you learn how to do this and adjust your timbre, like you can kind of fool people. Like the pitch range doesn't matter as much to me when it's more about like the energy of your voice and like the type of quality you're going for. So like you might find that it's hard for you to have a good full belt in a certain range, just because it's not where you're most comfortable with it. And if you move and modulate whatever song you're doing to a spot where that energy makes sense, then it'll still sound like the full arc of like going from a more relaxed kind of speech-like sound to more sung and have that kind of character arc or sort of like emotional arc to it. So sometimes when you're like modulating keys, if you go too low, it loses the right vibe for the song, right? Or you go too high, it starts to sound too energetic for perhaps what the song is going to be like. Um, and that's going to be something that you want to pay attention to based on your vocal range. But you can take songs and you can adjust them. You might find though that like if you take a song too low, it's going to be more in chest voice, and the character of it's going to start to change a little bit too when it's typically sung in head voice and things like that. So um, usually, once you start going like a third or a fourth away from the typical key, those things start to change more dramatically. Um, so, um, yeah, exactly. So that's kind of interesting, right? Like, so what you're talking about, like you're most comfortable in that sort of mixed range, and then it feels better as you get closer to falsetto. So that's an interesting point. So like the whole thing though is we have to start understanding these different sort of parts of our voice and sort of what we're comfortable with, and that helps us guide us to like what kinds of music we want to sing. Um, um, so yeah, and it's funny, right? So this is what's I'm just responding to some of these things, like Deborah, what you're saying, where like you want to be like a medium low singer, but like someone's like, oh no, you're a soprano. Like, you want to be careful with people telling you like, no, this is your voice, but you want us also like, pay attention to like some of these things that a teacher might tell you, but just know that like you can learn like as a soprano to find like a more comfortable chest voice. Like, in fact, a lot of the times, like with different voice types, I want to work the opposite thing that they're like avoiding to help them expand and open up their voice a little bit more. So, um, like this is where we have to be careful about like we can use this to sort of understand tendencies, but it can also limit us a little bit. And you can take any song that you're singing and start in a more comfortable tessitura, right? And kind of weight train it down lower or up higher. and start to get a sense of like what it sounds like in different spots. Um, just pay attention to like the comfort of your voice, because there's plenty of situations where like um, a more soprano singer is singing kind of low in their chest voice for particular things. And especially in like recording situations, you can kind of like plan it out so that you can get that aspect of your voice. Um, and so, like, I just think that sometimes we close it off and we narrow ourselves and put ourselves in a box when someone's like, "You're a soprano, so therefore you should only do this kind of music." There's always options, um, but sometimes you have to be a little creative about how you adjust your timbre or adjust the key of the song so you can kind of fool people sometimes. Um, but yes, there's a limit. Like I can't pull off like bass stuff. I just don't have that kind of voice. But you'll find like the voice types that are closest to you, you might be able to do that. So you can sort of explore some variability and sort of think of it as like a new character, right? Like sometimes when I'm helping people find like these other sides of their voice, like head voice, if they're not comfortable with it, um, is to actually think like a different personality character, and trying to imitate that character a little bit. So it's actually surprising how much flexibility we can have when we start to condition our voice appropriately. Um, yeah, and then this is I like that you mentioned that too. Like, so sometimes, like when we know our range and we know these moments of discomfort, we can modify our songs a little bit to match that. So that's the concept is actually like not just modulating the song to a lower key, but changing certain moments of the melody, maybe the vocalist, and doing something differently there, right? Or taking a different character choice, right? Some people might sing into a moment, and you might do the opposite and kind of like do a little floaty head voice thing instead because it feels more comfortable. So yeah, so this is this main concept again, right? Like if you're just showing up again, I'll kind of review. We in their basic sense think of our pitch range, which is kind of linear from bass to tenor, bass, baritone, tenor, alto, mezzo soprano, soprano in that order. Um, Bass being the lowest and soprano being the highest. Um, and the way we can kind of feel out this is um, we can do our uh, our hey, and woohoo sound for our three different sort of parts of our register. So low chest voice, high chest voice mix area, and then head voice. So we're like hmm, you're gonna feel more maybe rumble, vibration in the chest, low chest voice. So, right. It's gonna change a little bit from time to time. And then, hey, 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 right, hey. And I might test it out like with a little bit of more support, a little less support, and just sort of see where that range is. That's the middle. And then woohoo, woo, and you can again watch this on like a pitch monitor or something like that, and start to mark out where those three different zones are. Um, so yeah, that's a really interesting question about do you use more or less support in chest voice? So this is why, and this is I'm glad you said something like that. This is where vocal range things get complicated. So someone who's more comfortable in their chest voice area might find that they uh, use more they maybe like use more support and it fills out their voice. Someone who's less comfortable in their chest voice register may have trouble actually putting lots of support into their chest voice because their voice doesn't really sit there. So like this happens for sopranos a lot of the time is like they'll try to over support their chest voice and it'll crack, it'll go up into head voice because it doesn't really want to sit there. And we can only kind of be light down there and use more resonance tricks, whereas an alto might be able to kind of lean into it and step on the gas more. Um, so that can be variable depending on the voice type. Um, Typically, like as you go from your lowest notes in your chest voice to your highest notes in your chest voice, that's going to go from lower vocal support to more vocal support. And then as you go from your lowest notes in head voice to your highest notes, it's going to go from relaxed vocal support to more support. So overall, like it goes from low chest voices, like our lowest vocal support, to high head voice has lots of vocal support. But high head voice and high chest voice honestly are not super different in terms of support. In fact, sometimes like our belted chest voice, because it's an extension beyond like our normal chest voice, requires the most support to keep it stable. Uh, so it just really depends. So like for a soprano is probably using the most vocal support up on their high head voice notes if they're really trying to get like a very loud full sound. But this gets confusing because like sopranos, if you're really comfortable singing up there all the time, your vocal support might feel very toned and feel very effortless because your muscles are strong too, like that. So that concept is actually really complex based on the singer, and it's a little bit about the skill of the singer compared to their actual voice type. um, and those two things are going to play at that variability. So that's where it gets tricky, and you actually, working with a coach, you're learning how to maximize what you can do with your particular voice type, understanding your voice and what happens, and where the energy is. So where does your body need more energy to keep it going, um, or where does it feel like, when you put too much energy into it, it can't maintain it there. Like these are the things that tell you something about your voice. So it's funny, right? Because like you would think, oh, well, like then a soprano should be more comfortable with like high chest voice. But depending on the singer, they're like actually probably already in head voice and mixing. And so they may actually feel less comfortable singing into a heavier kind of a sound because they're not used to that timbre and using that overtone. And so they actually will sound like less full there. Whereas like an alto is going to start to kind of sound louder and louder as they go up through their chest voice, right? And then have like a little bit of head voice zone, but will not want to be up in that head voice zone. So yeah, you can see this when you have all of these different variables at play, it starts to get more complex, and I don't want to put people in a box a lot of the time. So sometimes the key to helping someone's range open up is understanding the resonance, understanding the break range, and understanding what registration tools you want to use. Um, I'm glad you also mentioning this one. Um, when we're talking about chest and head voice, it's actually like kind of a red flag if someone is telling you to widen the chest as an image to increase your chest voice. Where all of the resonance and all of it is happening in the vocal tract, we feel sympathetic vibration because of what we're doing and how the vocal folds are together in the vocal tract. We might feel more chest vibration. We might feel less chest vibration if we're like more in our head voice, and you might feel more vibration like right up here in this area, or just nothing. And it's like this analog space, and it just feels like it floats above your head. Um, those are all like the perception of singing, which is really helpful to understand. If you're like in chest voice a lot, you'll feel more vibration here, but it's sympathetic vibration. So when we understand that it's sympathetic, we don't want to try to physically augment anything. If anything, you just want to keep your chest nice and relaxed, and you can get a little bit of that extra bump of sympathetic vibration. But when we try to like expand or open our chest, we're often just causing unnecessary tension. And it might mess up our breath control and our support a little bit, actually. Um, so you want to think of it more like, right, when we're going from chest to head voice, it's more about the space of the vowel, like megaphoning out and bringing the resonance more towards the mask, versus kind of stretching back and actually covering. So like you'll notice with sopranos, they don't look like they're opening their mouth that much sometimes, right? They're like in this sort of realm, but the back is stretching and fluting out this direction, often. Whereas like an alto might be like more inclined to want to like fully megaphone out a little bit more. Um, yeah, yeah. This is the whole point, is like when you learn how to use the variables of vocal technique, like we're learning to adjust these same variables that kind of define our range and our voice type, and we learn to kind of move past those barriers. So um, yeah, this is really tricky. So again, like it's there's a lot of different ways that the voice can find stability and balance. They're not all there are some things that are like obviously more wrong, but there are different kinds of techniques. And so different kinds of voice types and singers, and also using different specific kinds of genres, and all of these variables add up to something that tends to be more efficient for you, right? And what is a technique but something that works, right? So this is the main point, is it's like a repeatable thing that keeps your voice healthy. And so you want to find like what your sweet spots are and work your voice from there. Find where it's most comfortable and start to expand it out and test sort of the limits of your genre, of your character type, of your timbre. And then you can start to develop some more flexibility and just have more options. Um, so kind of like for me, understanding voice type is a way that I can try to transcend the voice type a little bit. Although like like there's going to be a limit, right? Like ultimately I can't sing super low and I can't sing super high. So like that puts me as a middle voiced singer. And you'll find a lot of contemporary music, right, tends to sit kind of in the middle. We tend to get really high soprano stuff in like classical music, and sometimes in folk even as well. And we tend to get like the lowest stuff also in classical and choral, and sometimes in like country music too, actually, right? Which is interesting, tends to sit more in chest voice. Um, and then nowadays people are using like timbre modifying techniques for like using like in your recording software. It'll change the format of your voice. I don't know if you've played around with this, but this is another way that you can kind of understand a little bit about how this works and how our minds kind of process different voice types. Is you can like go through like a software and do one of the like format changing filters. And so there's like a couple like records where um, or albums where singers are doing this more, right? Like Bjork does this sometimes, right? Like Medilla, that record. Um, she's using timbre modifying techniques, and it makes it sound like she's like a tenor, and then like a high soprano, and then like it's really cool. And so you can kind of find your like tenor form of your voice without like pushing your technique or your like super high alto. I mean, the other examples of this are like using helium, right? Or changing the air density. And then all of a sudden when you do that, that changes your format. So that, this is kind of my point, is it's like we get a little stuck with the bigger physical concepts. And then as we start to think about these other variables, we realize it's like more interesting than that. Like when you change the density of the air, right, and you're using like helium or like if like nitrous on the other side, right, like that kind of will create like that lower sound on the voice. Um, and it's actually changing where your voice is comfortable with its format, right? And it's so there's a lot to it. There's complexity to it, but that's how people get used to like their chipmunk voice, right? And they can um, sing up much higher. There's even like these little like party like karaoke microphones, right? And they can do some of these pitch modulating, like octave doubling down or going up to higher octaves, and it just helps you like kind of hear like what would I sound like if I were like a bass or a tenor. And you might realize that you start changing your vocal technique a little bit because you're starting to emphasize different overtones. Um, and even like the character of your voice, you might start to do like faster things or slow down your sound a little bit just because of how it's sounding to you now. So uh, it's an interesting thing. So anyways, this is, you can think of this as like a really simplistic concept to understand generally where your voice sits, and then you can start to move into some other variables, right? Like the tone quality and timbre of your voice, where there's more energy is required for your voice to operate versus where it can do stuff very efficiently. Um, so where we start to strain is going to be like too high in a certain voice type range. And then where we start to press means that it's too low and our voice can't really put energy into it. It's sort of maxing it out early on because we're maybe using the wrong overtone or direction. Um, yeah, I love. Yeah, this is the whole. It's that concept of building the voice, right? So this is actually a great sort of place to sort of wrap up this concept. Is you can think of the voice as all of these different variables, and we're kind of constructing whatever tool we want. We're using our different, our tool belt, and we're constructing a contraption that fits whatever kind of music we're singing. There's going to be some limit, like over time, like I'm trending my voice in a certain direction, and it's going to get a little stuck. Like it's like a sculpting clay. We want that consistency so we can be confident, like I'm going to sing a certain way. But we can learn to use our vocal techniques to slowly shape things in a different direction if we need to do something different. So like sometimes I'm on my classical trend, sometimes I'm like working on contemporary music or folk music, and I'm going to start to think about adjusting these variables until my voice finds an efficient way to do that based on my voice type and range, and knowing the particular peculiarities of certain vowels that feel kind of stuck, right? So you'll find that certain voice types have particular paths for how they learn because there's certain kinds of tensions that are associated with that. Like if you're constantly trying to drop to low notes, you might have that really throaty thing and your tongue's pulling back. If you're in a bass realm, tenors, because we're up in that high range, our larynx might ride high and our tongue might kind of come forward, and we tend to have more nasality that we kind of have to work out a lot of the time. So, altos might find that they tend to shout and get too heavy and too loud as they go up too high. Same thing with basses. So with that in mind, we learn to sort of adapt our techniques to find the best balance for each voice type. So like when I have a soprano, I hear the similar kinds of complaints of like I don't feel full or emotional in my chest voice. So we work on accessing more chest voice and getting comfortable with changing the resonance, because it's just not the typical way that you talk and how you're used to your voice and the personality and character type of your voice. So we slowly adjust that over time, and then you're building in new potential to your voice. But always be mindful of how it feels, right? We want to sing where it's ultimately comfortable. So this progress is sometimes slow, and we don't want to like try to push a voice where it doesn't want to go too much, right? So just incrementally, and we want to understand how to adapt a voice so that it's more comfortable in places where it typically isn't. So you can see where there's some difficulty here, right? We have to be careful about how we do that. And as a beginning singer, don't be so quick to like put yourself in a box, because I've found so many times where like someone's like, I'm a low voiced singer, and they're just not using their support right, and they're straining a lot because they're not using resonance. And all of a sudden it's like, actually, I can kind of sing high baritone and tenor, and actually like it up there. I have a way higher head voice than I realized. And I like singing up in that sort of head voice range. So explore a little bit, but pay attention to what it feels like. Work in little pockets, give yourself a break, and then over time you can start to analyze like what type of voice you really are. So I'm always, it's just like a therapist or something like that. You don't want to be like, you want to be wary of someone who tells you like, kind of like, you're obviously this. I mean, like sometimes, but I want to just make sure that I get a little bit of time to understand a voice, especially as a beginning singer, before I really tell them like, this is what type of voice you are. This is a little more obvious, usually on like the lower end for like, or the extremes. But I've just heard this so many times with like colleagues and stuff like that, especially for female vocalists, where it can be a little more ambiguous actually. Where like someone's told them they're an alto for a super long time, and then they get another teacher, and their teacher's like, no, you're a soprano, and like they've ruined your voice and stuff. It's like, no. I mean, like, it's cool to learn that you have that extension, and that, maybe you try out soprano stuff and you realize you like it better. But it doesn't mean that it's like necessarily like destroyed you. I mean, you're ultimately in charge of your voice. And if you feel like, this is really uncomfortable, let's explore a different part of my voice. You want a teacher that is willing to help you figure that out and tell you sort of where you're going into a dangerous zone with your voice. But yeah, don't put yourself in a box. You might just be like someone who can do a little bit of both and like figured out actually that you shine most when you're singing more soprano stuff. So you just maybe never develop that part of your range actually, because again, society plays a role, and we sometimes are not used to speaking in head voice at all, right? Depending on what sort of culture you're from, and so you may be a soprano, but who's just like constantly been forcing your voice into low speech to like fit in with people, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going on a little bit, but appreciate all of you showing up and participating. It makes it really an enriched experience. My main point here again is to show that there's a simple way, and then it can get more and more complicated to figure out your voice. I think I can see a lot of frustration with people looking up their voice type and then getting all this like E5 to whatever it is, like, and it might feel like a little overwhelming and like um, too conceptual. So go with the physical thing first. Go with your simple hey, woohoo, and then start to figure out the rest over time, right? As you sing rep and you get your take from other people, like, what do you think of my voice as bright or dark or warm? And get some feedback from other people and your teacher. So and record yourself and compare it. So yes, as always, really, really awesome to see similar people following up with me, and we'll just keep moving forward with some other topics, and look forward to it. So I'll catch you all then, and take care for now. Peace.